In the snow-capped peaks of the Swiss Alps, February 1931, while the rest of the village of Grindelwald huddled around their fires and waited for spring, a woman named Maren Vogt was climbing a path that no one had walked in 40 years. The path led up the eastern face of the Schwarzhorn, past the tree line, past the last patches of grass, to a narrow plateau that hung over a 2,000-foot drop like a shelf carved by God's own hand. She carried on her back a pack containing everything she owned: 2 changes of clothes, a hunting knife, a coil of rope, a small amount of food, and the ashes of her mother in a tin box. She was 26 years old, and she was never coming back. The people of Grindelwald had made their feelings clear. A woman alone was a problem. A woman alone who refused to marry, who rejected every suitor the village council suggested, who insisted on living by her own rules in a community that had no room for such independence. That woman was more than a problem. She was a threat to the order of things. And so they had done what mountain villages have done for centuries to those who do not fit. They had made her life impossible. The whispers became accusations. The cold shoulders became closed doors. The final blow came when the village council revoked her family's grazing rights, the rights her father had worked 30 years to earn, stripping her of the only livelihood she had left. Maren could have surrendered. She could have accepted one of the marriage proposals, could have become someone's wife, someone's property, could have traded her independence for security and lived the rest of her life as a respectable woman. Many would have called that the sensible choice. But Maren Vogt had watched her mother die slowly, in a marriage that crushed her spirit long before it stopped her heart. She had promised herself, holding her mother's hand in those final hours, that she would never let anyone cage her the way her father had caged her mother. Death on a frozen cliff was preferable to a life lived on her knees. What she built on that impossible plateau would become legend. A home so remarkable that people would travel from across Europe to see it. A testament to human determination that still stands nearly a century later. If you are not subscribed to this channel, now is the time, because this story of one woman's defiance and the cabin that proved an entire village wrong is something you will never forget. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from, and let me tell you about the woman who made the mountain her home. The plateau Maren had chosen was not unknown to the people of Grindelwald. They called it the Teufelstisch, the Devil's Table, because legend held that Satan himself had carved it from the mountainside as a place to rest during his wanderings. No one had lived there since old Caspar Brunner, a hermit who had built a shelter on the plateau in the 1880s and died there alone during the terrible winter of 1891. His bones had been found in the spring, frozen in his bed, and since then the plateau had been considered cursed. The path that led there had been allowed to crumble. The memory of Caspar Brunner had become a warning told to children. This is what happens to those who try to live apart from the community. Maren knew the stories. She had grown up hearing them, had felt the delicious shiver of fear they were meant to provoke. But she also knew something the storytellers had forgotten. Her grandfather had been Caspar Brunner's only friend, had helped him build that original shelter, had visited him every month until the winter that killed him. Her grandfather had told her the truth about the Teufelstisch. It was not cursed. It was not impossible. Caspar Brunner had died not because the mountain was cruel, but because he was old and alone, and had broken his leg in a fall, unable to reach his supplies or signal for help. The plateau itself was surprisingly sheltered, protected from the worst winds by the peak above it, catching sun for most of the day, blessed with a spring that flowed year-round from a crack in the rock face. It was, her grandfather had said, one of the finest spots in the Alps for a home. if only someone had the courage to claim it. Maren had that courage. What she lacked was almost everything else. She reached the plateau on the third day of her climb, exhausted, half frozen, her supplies nearly gone. The remains of Caspar Brunner's shelter were still there, collapsed under decades of snow and neglect, little more than a pile of rotting timber and scattered stones. The spring still flowed, a thin stream of water so cold it made her teeth ache, but pure and clean. The view was staggering. The entire valley spread out below like a painting. The village of Grindelwald, a cluster of tiny shapes beside the dark line of the river. The peaks of the Eiger and the Jungfrau rising in the distance like monuments to eternity. Maren stood at the edge of the cliff, looking down at the world that had rejected her, and felt something she had not felt in months. Peace. The first weeks were survival in its most basic form. Maren cleared snow from a section of the plateau and erected a crude shelter from the salvaged timbers of Caspar's ruin, covering it with pine branches she hauled up from below the tree line. The shelter was barely large enough to lie down in, barely warm enough to keep her alive, but it was enough. She melted snow for water when the spring froze over in the coldest nights. She ate the dried meat and hard bread she had brought, rationing it carefully, knowing that she would need to find other sources of food soon, or starve. She learned to hunt in those early weeks, setting snares for rabbits and marmots, tracking the chamois that moved across the high slopes in search of the first spring grass. Her grandfather had taught her to shoot when she was a girl, over her father's objections, and now that skill kept her alive. She fashioned a bow from a young yew tree, a crude weapon but effective enough at close range. Her first kill was a rabbit, thin and stringy after the long winter, but she roasted it over her fire and ate every scrap, sucking the marrow from the bones, wasting nothing. The plateau itself began to reveal its secrets to her. She discovered that the spring never fully froze, that even in the coldest nights a trickle of water continued to flow from the crack in the rock. She found sheltered spots where the snow melted first, exposing patches of alpine herbs that could be eaten raw or brewed into tea. She located a small cave at the back of the plateau, barely more than a hollow in the rock, but dry and windless, a place to store supplies away from weather and animals. The mountain was not generous, but it was not as hostile as the villagers believed. It simply required attention, patience, and the willingness to learn. The people of Grindelwald learned of her presence within a week. A hunter spotted smoke rising from the Teufelsstiche and carried the news back to the village like a man reporting a miracle, or a disaster, he was not sure which. The reaction was immediate and intense. Some called her mad, predicting she would be dead before month's end. Others called her wicked, saying she had gone to consort with the devil who had carved her new home. A few, very few, called her brave, though they said it quietly, in private, where the village council could not hear. Heinrich Zeller, the head of the village council and the man whose marriage proposal Maren had most publicly rejected, made his position clear to everyone who would listen. He announced that the woman had made her choice and would face the consequences. He said no one from the village should help her, should trade with her, should acknowledge her existence in any way. She wanted to live apart from the community, he declared, so let her live apart completely. Let the mountain teach her what the village could not. The decree was followed by most, ignored by a few. An elderly woman named Britta Kaufmann, who had known Maren's mother and remembered her grandfather's stories about the Teufelsstiche, began leaving small packages of food at the base of the mountain path. She never climbed up, never spoke to Maren directly, but the packages appeared every week without fail, and Maren knew who was responsible. A young shepherd named Lucas Gerber, who had always admired Maren from a distance, began grazing his flock near the base of the path, and when packages needed to be carried up higher than Britta could manage, they somehow found their way there. But these small kindnesses could not build a home. That Maren would have to do herself. She began in earnest when the spring thaw came, working from first light until darkness forced her to stop. The plateau was roughly 50 meters wide and 30 meters deep, a natural terrace of solid rock covered with a thin layer of soil. At its back, the cliff rose another 100 meters to the peak above. At its front, the drop was sheer and absolute, a fall that would kill instantly. The sides were steep, but not vertical, covered with scrub and loose stone, climbable by goats and determined humans, but impassable to any vehicle or cart. Everything Maren needed would have to be carried up by hand. She started with stone, the one material the mountain provided in abundance. She gathered rocks from the slopes around the plateau, selecting them for size and shape, carrying them to the building site in a basket strapped to her back. Day after day, week after week, the pile grew. When she had enough for the foundation, she began to lay them, fitting them together without mortar in the old dry stone style her grandfather had taught her, each stone locked in place by the weight of the stones above it. The foundation alone took 6 weeks. Her hands blistered, bled, and hardened into something like leather. Her back ached constantly, a deep pain that never fully faded. She lost weight she could not afford to lose, her body consuming itself to fuel the endless labor. But the foundation rose, course by course, until it stood 3 feet high and formed a rectangle roughly 4 meters by 6 meters, the footprint of her future home. Word of her progress filtered down to the village. Some dismissed it as impossible, insisting that a woman could not build a house alone on a cliff. Others watched with growing unease as reports confirmed that she was still alive, still working, still refusing to fail. Heinrich Zeller's prediction of her imminent death began to look less like wisdom and more like wishful thinking. Summer brought both relief and new challenges. The weather warmed, making work easier, but it also brought thunderstorms that rolled across the peaks with terrifying speed. Maren learned to read the sky, to recognize the signs of approaching storms, to secure her materials and take shelter before the lightning came. She was caught out twice, huddling in her crude shelter while thunder shook the mountain and rain poured down in sheets. Both times she survived. Both times she went back to work the next morning. The walls went up faster than the foundation. Though faster was a relative term, Maren had decided on a construction method that combined stone and timber, using the rock for the lower walls and salvaged wood for the upper sections and roof. The timber was the greatest challenge. There were no trees on the plateau, and the nearest forest was 1,000 feet below. Every beam, every plank, every piece of wood had to be carried up the mountain on her back. She made the trip dozens of times, each time bringing back what she could carry: branches for framing, logs for beams, bark for insulation. She learned to select wood that was strong but light, to strip it of excess weight before beginning the climb, to rest at specific points along the path where the footing was secure. The path itself she improved as she went, clearing loose stones, cutting steps into the steepest sections, anchoring ropes at the most treacherous points. What had been a barely passable route became, over the course of the summer, a genuine path, still difficult, but no longer deadly. By September, the walls were complete. They rose 8 feet from the foundation, solid stone for the first 4 feet, and timber frame above, chinked with moss and clay against the wind. The structure had a single room, larger than her crude shelter but still modest by any standard. It had one door facing south toward the sun and the view, and 2 small windows, covered for now with oiled cloth until she could obtain glass. It had no roof, not yet. But the walls alone were enough to transform the space from a construction site into something that looked almost like a home. The roof was the final challenge of that first year. Maren had collected timber all summer, stockpiling it against the coming of autumn, when the weather would turn and outdoor work would become impossible. She built the roof frame in October, working through early snowfalls, her fingers numb inside her gloves, racing against the calendar. The frame went up in 2 weeks, a skeleton of beams and rafters that seemed impossibly fragile against the vast sky above. Covering the frame took another 3 weeks. Maren used wooden shingles split from logs, overlapping them like fish scales to shed rain and snow. She worked from the bottom up, balancing on the frame itself, reaching and stretching and hammering until her arms felt like they would fall off. The first heavy snow of winter caught her with 2/3 of the roof complete. She worked through the storm, covered in white, unable to feel her hands, driven by the knowledge that if she stopped now, everything she had built would be ruined by the weather. She finished on the last day of October, nailing the final shingle into place as darkness fell and the temperature dropped towards 0. She climbed down from the roof, stumbled through her door, and collapsed onto the pile of blankets that served as her bed. She slept for 14 hours, the deepest sleep of her life, and woke to find herself in a house. It was not yet a home. The interior was bare stone and rough timber, without furniture, without decoration, without any of the comforts that make a shelter into something more. But it was solid. It was dry. When Maren lit a fire in the simple hearth she had built into the back wall, the room warmed quickly and held its heat. She had done what everyone said was impossible. She had built a house on the devil's table, alone, with nothing but her own 2 hands. The first winter was hard but survivable. Maren had stockpiled food through the autumn, trading labor for supplies with the few villagers willing to defy Heinrich Zeller's decree. She had dried meat and fish, stored root vegetables in a cold corner of the cabin, accumulated enough firewood to last until spring. The cabin held up well, the roof shedding snow, the walls blocking wind, the hearth providing enough heat to keep the interior above freezing even on the coldest nights. She was alone, utterly alone, for weeks at a time when the path became impassable. But she found she did not mind the solitude. After a lifetime of being watched and judged and found wanting, the silence of the mountain felt like freedom. Spring brought a visitor Maren had not expected. A goat. The animal appeared one morning at the edge of the plateau, a young female with a brown and white coat, clearly domestic, but without any marking to indicate ownership. She had somehow climbed up from the valley, following paths that even Maren had not discovered, drawn perhaps by the smoke from the cabin, or the patches of grass beginning to emerge from the snow. Maren watched her for a full day before approaching, moving slowly, speaking softly, offering a handful of dried apple from her dwindling supplies. The goat accepted the gift and did not run. Within a week, the goat was sleeping beside the cabin door. Within a month, she was following Maren everywhere, a companion more loyal than any dog. Maren named her Britta, after the old woman who had left packages at the base of the path, and began building a shelter for her against the cabin wall. A goat meant milk. Milk meant cheese. Cheese meant a source of food that did not depend on hunting or foraging, or the charity of villagers who could barely spare what they gave. Britta was only the first. Over the following years, other goats found their way to the plateau, some wandering up on their own, others purchased from farmers with the money Maren earned selling cheese and herbs in the market at Interlaken, a town far enough from Grindelwald that Heinrich Zeller's influence did not reach. By the 3rd year, she had a herd of 8, enough to provide milk for herself and a surplus to trade. She built a proper shelter for them, a small barn attached to the cabin, with hay storage above, and a fenced area where they could graze on the plateau's thin grass. The cheese Maren produced became known throughout the region. She had learned the craft from her mother, who had learned it from her mother before her, a tradition of alpine cheese-making that stretched back generations. But Maren's cheese was different, people said. It had a flavor that could not be replicated in the valley, something wild and clean that came from the high pastures and the pure spring water, from herbs that grew only above the tree line. Restaurants in Interlaken and Bern began requesting it by name. Wealthy tourists sought her out, climbing the difficult path for the privilege of buying cheese directly from the woman who made it. She expanded her enterprise carefully, never taking on more than she could manage alone. She gathered herbs from the slopes around the plateau, edelweiss and gentian, arnica and alpine mint, plants prized for their medicinal properties and their rarity. She dried them in bundles hung from the cabin rafters and sold them to apothecaries who paid premium prices for authentic alpine specimens. She collected honey from wild bees that nested in the rock crevices, a luxury product that fetched extraordinary sums in the lowland markets. The income allowed her to improve her situation steadily. She bought better tools, warmer clothes, books to fill the long winter evenings. She hired Lucas Gerber to bring up supplies too heavy for her to carry alone, sacks of flour and salt, barrels of preserved food, the glass panes for her windows. She was not wealthy by any standard, but she was self-sufficient, beholden to no one, dependent on nothing but her own labor and the mountain's gifts. The cabin itself grew as well. Maren added a second room, then a covered porch facing the view, then a root cellar dug into the rock beneath the floor. She obtained proper glass for the windows, trading 2 months' worth of cheese for a set of panes carried up from the valley by Lucas Gerber, who had become her most reliable connection to the world below. She built furniture from timber hauled up the mountain, a bed frame, a table, chairs, shelves for her growing collection of books and tools. The bare survival shelter of the first year became, by the 5th year, a genuine home, comfortable and well-equipped, lacking nothing essential. The people of Grindelwald could no longer pretend she did not exist. The smoke rising from the Teufelstisch was visible on clear days, a constant reminder that the woman they had cast out was still there, still alive, still thriving. Travelers began seeking out her plateau, drawn by stories of the impossible cabin and the woman who had built it alone. They brought news from the outside world and left with stories of their own, spreading Maren's legend across Switzerland and beyond. Heinrich Zeller watched his prediction of her failure become a joke told at his expense. The woman he had expected to die within months had survived 5 years, then 10, then 15. She had built a home more impressive than most in the village, had established a successful business in goat cheese and mountain herbs, had become famous while he remained what he had always been, a small man in a small village with a small mind. His decree forbidding contact with her was quietly forgotten. His authority diminished with each passing year. When he died in 1952, bitter and largely unmourned, Maren Vogt sent flowers to his funeral, a gesture that some called gracious and others called a final victory. The winter of 1937 brought the storm that would cement Maren's legend forever. It began in early December, a blizzard that rolled in from the north with a ferocity that even the oldest villagers had never seen. Snow fell for 3 days without stopping, piling up in drifts that buried houses to their roof lines. The temperature dropped to 30 below zero. The wind howled through the valley like a living thing, tearing off shutters, collapsing roofs, killing livestock by the dozens. In Grindelwald, 7 people died, frozen in their homes, caught outside when the storm hit, killed when roofs collapsed under the weight of snow. The village was paralyzed, cut off from the outside world for nearly 2 weeks. When the skies finally cleared and the digging out began, the first thought on many minds was the same. What had happened to the woman on the cliff? The answer came 3 days after the storm, when Maren herself appeared at the edge of the village, walking down from the mountain as calmly as if it were a summer afternoon. She had come to check on Britta Kaufmann, she said, worried that the old woman might not have survived the storm. She found Britta alive, but cold, her house damaged, her supplies nearly exhausted. Maren stayed for 2 days, helping repair the damage, sharing food from her own stores, caring for the woman who had cared for her when no one else would. The villagers who saw her could not believe their eyes. She was healthy, well-fed, dressed warmly in clothes that showed no sign of desperate poverty. Her cabin had survived the storm without damage, she told them, protected by the peak above from the worst of the wind, insulated by walls thick enough to hold heat even in the deepest cold. Her goats were fine, sheltered in their barn, eating hay she had stockpiled through the autumn. She had barely noticed the storm, she said, except for the beauty of the snow forming past her windows, and the silence that followed. The same storm that had killed 7 villagers and destroyed homes throughout the valley had been, for Maren Fote, nothing more than a few days of enforced rest. After that, the village's attitude changed completely. The woman who had been cast out as a disgrace was now treated as something between a celebrity and a saint. People came to her for advice on building, on weatherproofing, on surviving the mountain winters. Young women who chafed against the village's expectations began to see her as proof that another kind of life was possible. Even the village council, now led by men who had never supported Heinrich Zeller's decree, formally apologized for the treatment she had received and restored her family's grazing rights, though by then she had no need of them. Maren lived on her plateau for another 41 years, until her death in 1978 at the age of 73. She never married, never had children, never compromised the independence she had fought so hard to achieve. But she was not alone. Over the decades, she took in dozens of visitors, some staying for days and some for months, all of them seeking something that the world below could not provide. She taught them what she knew: how to build, how to survive, how to find peace in solitude and strength in self-reliance. Many of them would later say that their time on the Teufelstisch had changed their lives. Among her visitors were writers and artists, scientists and philosophers, ordinary people escaping ordinary troubles, and extraordinary people seeking extraordinary silence. A famous novelist spent 3 months in her cabin in 1954, working on a book that would later win international prizes. A mountaineer, recovering from a nearly fatal accident, lived with her for a full year, learning to walk again on the steep paths around the plateau. A young woman fleeing an abusive marriage arrived in 1962 with nothing but the clothes on her back, an echo of Maren's own arrival 30 years before. Maren took her in, taught her everything, and watched her build her own life somewhere else, carrying the lessons of the mountain with her. Maren kept a journal throughout her years on the plateau, a record of weather and wildlife, of visitors and solitude, of the slow accumulation of years in a place most people could not imagine calling home. The journal runs to over 40 volumes, written in her small, precise handwriting, documenting everything from the first crocus of spring to the last storm of autumn. It has become an invaluable resource for historians and ecologists, a detailed record of climate and nature in the high Alps across nearly 5 decades. But it is also a portrait of a mind at peace with itself, a woman who found in solitude not loneliness, but freedom. The cabin still stands today, maintained now by a trust established in Maren's will. It has been expanded and modernized, equipped with solar panels and a satellite connection, but the original structure remains at its core. The stone walls she laid by hand, the timber frame she hauled up the mountain on her back, the hearth where she sat through 50 winters watching the snow fall past her window. Visitors come from around the world to see it, to walk the path she improved, to stand on the plateau where she proved that survival is not just about endurance, but about building something that lasts. The goats are still there too, descendants of Britta and the herd that followed. They graze on the thin grass of the plateau, watched over now by a rotating group of caretakers who apply for the privilege of spending a season in Marin's home. The waiting list is years long. Something about the place calls to people, something beyond the spectacular view or the remarkable history. Perhaps it is the proof it offers that a single person, with nothing but determination and time, can build something magnificent. Perhaps it is the reminder that the judgments of others are not final, that being cast out is not the same as being defeated. Marin never wrote a memoir or gave interviews about her life. She refused every offer from journalists and filmmakers who wanted to tell her story, saying that the cabin spoke for itself and needed no explanation. But she did leave behind one document, a letter found after her death, addressed to no one in particular, and everyone who might read it. The letter was short. It said that she had not built the cabin to prove anything to anyone. She had built it because she needed a home, and no one would give her one. She had not survived the mountain to show that women could do what men could do. She had survived because dying was not acceptable, and living required shelter. She had not become a legend on purpose. She had simply refused to become a tragedy. The letter ended with a single line that has been quoted countless times since, carved now into a stone marker at the trailhead where Marin's path begins its climb to the plateau. They told me I could not live there, so I built a life there instead. What would you build if everyone told you it was impossible? What summit would you climb? What home would you make if the valley below offered nothing but judgment and closed doors? Drop your answer in the comments, and if this story inspired you, if it made you think about what you might be capable of if you stopped listening to those who say you cannot, consider subscribing to this channel. We tell stories like this every week, stories of people who built their dreams in places others feared to tread. Hit the subscribe button and the notification bell, and I will see you in the next video. Because somewhere out there, right now, someone is being told they cannot survive, and maybe they are already climbing.